Rhoda Shermer, and I'm thrilled we can bring you two distinguished thought leaders on this topic, Michael Shepard and Christy Lunds Trujillo. For those of you joining NFRPP for the first time, we encourage you to visit our website, nfrpp.org, to learn more about our work. But essentially, we bring respected experts to our public arena to help all of us better understand the complex challenges of our time, foster civil discussions and solutions. With trusted information, we believe we will learn more than we knew before and better serve our democracy. We always enjoy a lively Q&A, so keep those questions coming. We will do our utmost to get you answers during the session. Please use the Q&A tab. With that, I'd like to introduce our special guests. Their detailed bios are on the NFRPP website, so I can be brief. Hi, Christy. Hi, Michael. Thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you. Our first speaker is Professor Lunds Trujillo. She is the Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of South Carolina. Her research adopts a political psychology framework to explore mass political behavior, particularly as it relates to the rural-urban divide. She has published in many journals and appeared on various media. Following her will be Michael. And Michael is an assistant professor in the Department of Government and the Health and Society program at the University of Texas in Austin. His Ph.D. dissertation, which was received from Vanderbilt University, was titled Unhealthy Democracy: How Partisan Politics is Killing Rural America. So with that, I invite you all to listen to our two speakers, and I will turn the program over to Chrissy. I will disappear and come back for the Q&A. So welcome everybody, and thank you.
All right, thank you, Rhoda, and hello everyone. My name is Kristen Lunds Trujillo, and as Rhoda said, I'm Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of South Carolina. And today I'm going to be talking to you about some of my work as it relates to rural identity and grievances and how that matters in trying to understand the current urban-rural division in political attitudes and voting behavior in the United States. And so a lot of you have probably seen some version of this map. This map is the 2020 presidential election results by county. And so you can, a lot of times when you see these maps, the first thing that comes to mind is, wow, there's a lot of red in rural areas and there's a lot of blue in urban areas. And so these maps are good illustrations of urban-rural division. And this urban-rural divide's been widening over time. For example, even in the past two presidential elections, just as an example, Trump was able to win 65% of the rural vote in 2020, and that's up from 59% in 2016. And so this urban-rural division has been widening over the past few decades. Again, where rural areas are becoming increasingly Republican and urban areas more Democrat. I just want to also point out that while we are probably very much aware of urban-rural political division, there are notable exceptions to this urban-rural divide, not just in places like the Southern Black Belt. For example, if you look in Southern Texas, predominantly blue and rural, due to the large Hispanic populations, Native American reservations, et cetera. But there's also regional differences too, such as Massachusetts and Vermont. Vermont's actually the most rural state, and notice in this map that all of the counties are or went blue. But with that said, there is definitely an urban-rural divide in the United States when it comes to politics, and it's increasing. And so why is it the case? Well, researchers have come across several explanations for why it's been happening, and these explanations have actually, they sort of interlink with one another. But broadly speaking, these four explanations revolve around, first, demographic changes across geography. And so these demographic changes are a result of broader structural changes, especially economic changes that have happened over the course of the 20th century, where there has been a decline in blue-collar work in much of rural America. Because rural America had been so dependent on that type of economy, thinking about mining, manufacturing, and agriculture, the loss of jobs and the decline in wages or salary in those areas couldn't really keep up with the appeal of white-collar jobs, which tend to be more centered in suburban and urban areas. And so young people tended to leave for cities. They'd go get a college degree, and then they'd stay in those urban and suburban areas. And then as that was happening, this resulted in a bunch of demographic changes so that rural areas tend to be older. They tend to be less likely to have a college degree, or people there tend to be less likely to have a college degree. They tend to work on, blue collar jobs. And some of these different demographic shifts align with the coalitions of the two major political parties in the United States. And so that's some of the reason. But that wouldn't explain, say, like a 6 or 7 percentage point difference in voting, over from 2016 to 2020, right? That's a gradual change that's happening over time. Again, going to the next potential explanation or partial explanation here is that over time, also in the 20th century, there have been changes to how the parties have been configured in the United States and which groups are part of either the Democratic or Republican Party. And in particular, urban-rural division became more prominent in the middle of the 20th century, but especially in the South, with the realignment and Southern strategy of the Republican Party, which broke apart the New Deal coalition and tried to appeal to certain groups, specifically those groups or individuals who are more, racially conservative, pro-segregationist at the time, white evangelicals a little bit later, cultural conservatives a little bit after that. And so that made it so that areas that were more rural tended to have these demographic groups that, again, aligned with one of the two major parties. And so that, again, goes sort of with that first explanation. In addition, there's been, as I've mentioned, decline in rural areas, and the decline itself is also a potential contributing factor to why people in rural areas might vote a certain way. As I said, rural areas have declined economically and socially, and this has left a sense of grievance in some rural areas that have felt this in particular, a feeling of being left behind by the rest of society, not being helped by those in power or those in charge. And so because those grievances and issues haven't been addressed in people's minds, there's been a push toward or a move towards more anti-establishment conservative candidates. And finally, the final explanation is that because there has been a different set of circumstances or experiences that have happened more often in rural areas, and because culturally we have created a division between country mouse and city mouse, where we have this perception that people from rural areas are a certain way. There are negative stereotypes, such as being backwards, ignorant, etc., but also, some idyllic sorts of stereotypes as well. So culturally, we've sort of created this difference alongside some of these lived experiences that have happened as a result of changes in the 20th century. All these things together have created a separate culture or way of life or identity among rural people. And so these different factors are completely interrelated. There's a lot of moving parts here. But in my research in here today, I want to talk a little bit more about that last piece in particular, sort of all these different things coming together potentially in how rural Americans might think about the world and how that matters for politics. And so with a rural identity, my argument is that these unique shared experiences and these cultural signifiers create a separate sense of identity among rural people, that they see themselves potentially as separate from the rest of society. So this is how I define rural identity, in that being a rural person or from a rural place is part of one's sense of self. All right, and this is just some recent research, a chart of from some research I published, looking at the prevalence of such a rural identity among people who grew up in a rural area and or currently live in a rural area. All right, And so what you can see here is that rural identity is roughly correlated with current rural residency. So most people who are current residents do hold this identity of being from a rural place, of that, being a rural person as being important, of having or being more likely to have some of this culture, worldview, or attitudes. But also note that there are some people who do not live in a rural area, but they still hold this identity. A good chunk of those people grew up in a rural area and left. So this points to this idea of socialization as well. People might be socialized, again, pointing to that worldview, separate worldview and culture, attitudes, being socialized as youth and then leaving, but holding some of that as people leave. Even many non-rural people hold this identity too, likely because they feel that shared culture, worldview, and attitudes. They're more reflective of who people think of themselves as. And so why does this matter for politics? What about the question at hand in that urban-rural divide that I talked about at the beginning of the talk? We know from social psychology that, that people who strongly identify with a particular group are very motivated to act on behalf of that group and to sort of think in terms of that group. In the case of rural identity, such people are going to be particularly interested in helping rural Americans and the communities that they live in, the rural communities they live in. They should also be more likely to link their identity with political attitudes and behaviors because they sort of think of themselves that way, and they're more likely to connect what's going on in rural America to their political attitudes and choices. And so in groundbreaking work by Kathy Kramer, using interviews, she finds that rural identity comes along with this shared set of grievances and this anti-establishment sentiment. And these grievances are against the powers that be, which are also perceived to be, clustered in urban centers. And these grievances include, first of all, a perceived lack of respect towards rural areas by broader society, sort of being looked down upon, those negative stereotypes, a perceived lack of representation in decision-making, and then a perceived lack of appropriate resources given to them. And I can go into some of these later in terms of describing what this might mean. But broadly speaking, these are some of the grievances that might go along with people who hold a rural identity. And so then enterprising political candidates can appeal to these grievances against the current people perceived to be in charge. And that leads to support for populist and anti-establishment candidates in particular, which is there's a contingent of such individuals in the Republican Party now. Notably, such populist grievances aren't new among rural Americans. In fact, the populist movement in the late 1800s in the United States was largely fueled by rural interests against economic elites at the time. And that helped pave the way actually for New Deal programs. There was a downside or some negatives that went along with that as well. For example, a lot of that movement was highly anti-Semitic. But again, going back to the main point, this sentiment that rural Americans tend to support more populist movements because of these sort of specific grievances to place isn't a new thing. In any case, existing research have found that rural identity and these different grievances predict distrust, a whole host of attitudes relating to political behavior, such as distrust towards expertise in government, partisanship, immigration attitudes, populism, and more. And so then there's a question, all right, we know all this. Given the research, we as in academics and others sort of looking at this, this line of thought here, we know this information. So where does this leave us? Where do we go from here in understanding the urban-rural divide and potentially trying to bridge it? So remember that rural identifiers are going to be highly interested in helping those in their communities, and of there being sort of an inclusion of rural people and rural voices in what are sort of institutions of power. Furthermore, broader culture through, again, negative stereotypes and rhetoric, as well as in some politics even use this sort of stereotype, can help fan the flames of disrespect. So again, relying on some of those negative stereotypes makes all this worse, especially if it's coming from, say, academia or politics, etc. And so given our knowledge, there's some implications for constructive engagement. So the first is to try to strengthen institutional trust. And one way we can do this is through more rural representation and opportunities in government and science. in academia, for example. For instance, rural high schoolers are significantly less likely to go into STEM fields compared to their urban counterparts. People in rural areas are less likely to have a college degree. So again, there's this sort of shutting out of rural individuals in these, areas of society that do hold power a lot of times, and that can help, bridging that gap or creating more inclusive space in some of those institutions can help increase that trust. Another is to balance aid given to rural areas, such as economic and social aid, alongside giving those rural areas autonomy at the same time. So not necessarily just giving rural, and what I mean by that is giving rural areas a say in what they would need from government or what they would want from government, and not necessarily, just blindly getting something from government that maybe wouldn't be as appropriate or helpful. So again, including rural voices in that decision making. And relating to kind of what I said before, listening, genuinely understanding some of those grievances, trying to understand where they're coming from, trying to not be condescending and respecting a different way of life. So just generally, sort of the basics of trying to understand an us versus them or bridging us versus them. And then along with that, trying to emphasize common goals and values across the urban-rural divide when it comes to politics. There are certain things that unite us as a nation. And so I think relying on those to try to create a common language can be helpful. With that, I thank you for listening to my presentation, and I look forward to the discussion and Q&A.
Awesome. I think it's my turn now. I'm going to attempt to remember how to share my screen here. Let's see here. Actually,
Michael, it's the share button at the bottom.
I see the share button, but I'm not finding my actual file here that I'm wanting to open up. Here we go. Can everybody see that?
Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you all again. I'm just gonna, similar to Chrissy, share a little bit of my work and some of my thoughts on the rural-urban divide. A lot of my work focuses on the urban-rural divide through the lens of healthcare politics. And so that'll be what I focus on this evening. As many of us are probably aware, many rural communities have experienced severe declines in access to healthcare over the last 20 or 30 years in a variety of ways. This has occurred alongside things like the opioid epidemic and COVID-19 that have really ravaged many rural communities. At the same time as these vulnerable Americans are living perilously far from much needed healthcare. As part of this decline over the last decade or so, there's been a fairly steep decline in life expectancy for rural Americans that is not observed for those that do not live in rural communities. This decline predates COVID-19. So if we excluded COVID-19 and focused on data up to 2018 or 2019, we would still see as much of a decline as we observe here. And at this point, urban Americans now live almost 4 years longer on average than rural Americans, which may not seem like a ton, but in the whole grand scheme of things, is actually a massive difference in life expectancy. These health differences can be seen across a variety of indicators. So if we look at stuff like the percentage of the population that is uninsured, the percentage of the population that reports being in poor or fair health, the infant mortality rate, things like the number of years of life lost to deaths before the age of 75, everywhere we look, we can see that on average, rural communities are suffering worse health outcomes than urban ones. There's a lot of variation, though, in these outcomes across the country. As we can see, if we look at things like poor and fair health or on insurance rates, what we can see is that by and large, the South and parts of Appalachia are where we have the most severe rural health outcomes in comparison to the rest of the country. Though if we were to look at some other indicators, we may observe some slightly different patterns. So I asked the question in my work, how do all of these declines in healthcare over the last 30 years relate to the changing electoral politics of rural and urban voters over the same time period? Previous scholars in fantastic work called Strangers in Their Old Land, for example, referred to this as the Great Paradox, which is, why is there rising rural republicanism in the face of things like declining health outcomes or declining economic opportunities that at least scholars or maybe political thinkers think, oh, this ought to lead voters to support Democrats. But instead, over the last 30 years, we can see a steep decline in support for the Democratic Party at the same time as there has been this decline in rural health. I argue, well, there are a lot of things going on that contribute to this, and a lot of them have to do with politics. But one of them has to do with rural identity in the same way that Chrissy was just talking about. So many rural Americans identify with the cultural and material struggles, but also just prideful elements of their communities and their societies. As a result, lots of rural Americans hold a positive attachment to their communities. But as outcomes have worsened in many rural spaces, perceptions of resentment have built. And so I argue that in many places, what this means is that the worse things get, the more resentful rural Americans feel, and the less they want government to help them, and the less, in particular, they want to support Democrats, in part because they blame the government vaguely and Democrats specifically for many of these struggles. We can think about things like NAFTA leading to declines in rural manufacturing and being signed into law by a Democratic president. In my own work, I focus on some of the more ironic effects of the Affordable Care Act that led to negative outcomes in rural spaces in the South, leading ironically to increased support for Democrats. And so part of what's going on here is that the resentment sort of starts a causal path leading towards right-wing politics, as Chrissy has stated, but also sort of as an hostility against help from government intervention, largely because the outcomes offer evidence to rural Americans that programs like these don't really come to help communities like theirs. They mostly go to help other people or other communities. And so the bad outcomes are part of the evidence in the case against the government in the various programs that more progressive politicians may pilot in the Democratic Party in particular. So we can look at this in a variety of ways. This is one way, which would be, if we look at the state level, the difference in the number of, or the percentage of rural people saying they're in poor or fair health versus that in urban, and we can calculate an average at the state level. That's sort of a disparity score, if you will. And if we look at the average level of rural resentment based on some survey measures that I've created, what we can see is that there is a strong positive relationship between how different the health outcomes in a state are between its rural communities and its urban, and how resentful its rural residents are towards the government and overall. We can look at this also when we look at specific health policies. So from left to right, this shows support for the Affordable Care Act, Medicare for all, and a more general question about whether or not the government should guarantee access to healthcare. What we can see is that as individuals increase in rural resentment, they're much more likely to believe that the Affordable Care Act should be repealed. We can see the same thing, that as rural resentment increases, we have less support for Medicare for all. This is reverse coded in this case. And then as rural resentment increases, fewer individuals are less likely to believe that the government should guarantee access to healthcare. And so in essence, what we're seeing is the worse things are, the more resentful rural individuals tend to be. And in turn, the less likely they are to support a variety of public policies that Democratic politicians or more liberal thinkers have tried to design to improve rural healthcare in some cases in particular, but improve healthcare overall. We can see this playing out in some other ways as well. So in one of my research projects, I look at rural hospital closures and the politics of the Affordable Care Act. So the Affordable Care Act included a number of provisions that helped rural hospitals, but helped rural health in general. But the primary thing that the ACA did for helping rural hospitals was expand Medicaid coverage via the expansion of, I'm tying my tongue here, the expansion of Medicaid. Sorry about that. However, this was a state choice. And so by 2012, due to a Supreme Court decision, states were allowed to decide for themselves whether or not they wanted to expand Medicaid. And this became a really partisan decision. All of the Democratic states expanded Medicaid, and all of the Republican states sort of engaged in a variety of different patterns. Now we're down to just a handful of states that have not expanded, but initially, at least, there was pretty significant Republican resistance. The expansion of Medicaid helped rural hospitals essentially by reducing the number of people who were showing up at hospitals without health insurance, right? So individuals who don't have health insurance, as a result of federal law, are eligible to receive health care at emergency rooms, and as a result, often do so. This leads basically to the hospitals to have to stomach a lot of costs of the healthcare of these individuals who aren't insured. By expanding Medicaid, which was deeply helpful for rural areas, rural hospitals in Medicaid expansion states basically received a financial lifeline, whereas the rural hospitals in states that did not expand it received no benefit. So what we see is after the Supreme Court decision, which I've noted here in the dotted line, there's a massive increase in the number of hospitals closing in states that did not expand Medicaid. And there's been a gradual decrease in the number of hospitals in expansion states that have closed. In turn, rural voters responded by blaming Democratic politicians. So this plot shows that individuals that experienced a rural hospital closure were about 10 percentage points more likely to support the Republicans in the following election. And this is mostly driven by their decreased support for the Affordable Care Act, which we see on the top, by about equal amounts. And so what this shows, as I have sort of alluded to over the last few slides, is essentially when bad things happen in rural communities or rural areas experience decline, rural voters aren't blind, they're not unaware, they perceive these negative shocks to their communities as being the fault of the government in general or the fault of Democratic politicians, and respond resentfully by blaming these sort of more elite and distant institutions for what is happening in their communities, and in turn move rightward. So in essence, the worse outcomes are in rural areas, the more rural people express resentment towards government and cities about their conditions. Rural individuals expressing resentment are less supportive of policies and politicians who are offering these policies designed to help rural health disparities. This potentially leads to what we might call a rural health spiral, which is the outcomes themselves become evidence that the policies don't work, and therefore support for policies that might help in the future are actually reduced in the long run. And with that, I will also stop sharing. All right, I'm not sure if at this point we're supposed to go back and forth or not, but
I think so, yeah.
Okay, I wanted to ask, part of the emerging debate, I guess one of the emerging debates in this literature is how much of this is cultural versus material. And I know you have some work that speaks to that. And so I wanted to know some more about your thoughts on how much of the rural-urban divide is about the material experiences and policy representation differences between urban and rural communities versus the more cultural elements that you discussed?
Yeah, that's a good question. In some work I did, I looked at this. I tried to divide those, those grievances or parts of the resentment into, more cultural or respect-based versus it being more about, we not getting the adequate resources we need. And I found it was more, at least when it comes to, the ones who are really supportive of, say, Donald Trump or more strongly Republican identified, they tend to be higher in those like disrespect sort of cultural indicators. And I think there are a few things with that. I don't think just because there's that finding, I don't think the material stuff is, not a factor. I think one of the reasons or one way that I think people sort of express that or think about it becomes much more cultural in a feeling of sort of cultural disrespect. So the material stuff is like stuff that's happening very much, but that's sort of interpreted as the rest of society looking down on them and not giving them enough of the resources, or giving them what they want. It might be a little bit more also downstream. People sort of think immediately there's this disrespect, this lack of representation. But that might have been spurred on by these really broad, economic changes happening as well. That's one possibility. Another possibility, I think, is that there might also, as Michael pointed out, there's variation within rural America and quite a bit. And so I think, in some older political science literature, there's this idea that as people have more material wealth, or, money, resources, et cetera, they become more concerned about cultural issues. And so I think, there might be some people, for instance, living in a rural area in decline, but are doing fairly well themselves. They might be more likely to, think about things a certain way or think of it more as cultural versus other people might, in rural areas who maybe aren't as well off, might be thinking about it more in terms of economics, just as one example. So I think there might be some heterogeneity there as well in terms of, I find there's this overall finding that there's a tendency among all rural American or whatever, the sample of rural Americans we looked at. But I think there's probably some complexity there where I wouldn't just flat out say it's only cultural at all, or maybe not even fully. I don't know. But yeah, it's a great question.
Yeah, I like your take on that. I feel like there must be some way in which they're intertwined entirely, right? Like the increased salience of one sort of necessarily leads to the other. It seems like, and you've seen in your work and I've seen in mine, it seems like most people simultaneously hold at least some combination of these things, maybe one dimension more strongly than another. But what's, I think, perplexing about trying to answer this question is exactly what you pointed out previously, which is that a lot of the people who are better off themselves in rural America in relative terms have some of the same attitudes in some cases as individuals who are worse off in rural America. And most of the time, we're only hearing, I think, in some ways from those who have at least some privilege, some resource advantage. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they're any different than individuals who aren't answering our internet surveys, right, and things like that. I think it's such a fascinating political space because of how commonly held some of the attitudes are across things like class, right?
Yeah, that is also true. So there is also that there might be differences, but there is a lot of commonality, even kind of shockingly. My question for you, or one question I have for you, Michael, is so you described this like rural death spiral, which is scary. What do you think are some ways that government could, stop it or try to mitigate those that from happening? Is it something with how the policies might be advertised? Is it the content of the policy, which obviously to some extent, if it helps rural areas, then it could be, hopefully that would be better received. Is it just we're screwed because of how partisan rhetoric works? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think policy is critical for explaining why we're here in the first place, and I think it can play an important role for getting us out. I do think that this is, a world where we see some changes in the coming future. So as the Republican Party increasingly relies on the rural voter, they will presumably have to increasingly represent the rural voter's material and cultural interests better in some ways. I think there's a lot of evidence that the cultural representation is already there. It's the material representation that's lacking. But I see some signs that there might be some changes, maybe there, or maybe some conflict, at least within the Republican Party now, about how much these things can be ignored. So the opioid epidemic got a lot of Republican, at least rhetoric. There are various states that have attempted, and the Republican governors that have attempted to do some things to shore up rural hospital financing. So I think a lot of this ultimately comes down to the responsibility of Republican leadership to enact policies that maybe aren't big government liberalism policies, but are designed to use maybe market-oriented solutions to improve the outcomes. I do think we have to reimagine some of this. The reason that some rural communities even have hospitals is in large part because of programs from like the New Deal that built these hospitals over 30 or 40 years. And it's not obvious to me that we really need to go build hospitals in small remote communities to solve the problem. And those create financial problems just as much as they may solve health problems. But I do think there is a world where we can reimagine that policy space. You talked about autonomy and sort of providing a space for the rural voter who maybe is distrustful of some of these policies to benefit. And I think thinking about policy solutions that allow for autonomy, things like rebates or medical debit cards that the government maybe provides some sort of subsidy that allows the individual to basically take health into their own hands, but under the government dollar rather than a big government program. This is a very simplistic example, but I think there are creative solutions to these problems, but I think they require political courage. I think there's some interest in the Democratic Party for doing these types of things, but I really think in the long, or at least in the short term, this is about whether or not the Republican Party wants to also materially represent these voters. And I think there are some signs that they want to, but we will see as far as like getting the voters themselves on board with these things. If the bad experiences drive resentment, then I'm hopeful that good experiences drive positivity.
Right.
I think there's an asymmetry there where the vengeance is a little bit more powerful perhaps than the reward, but I do think that there are some, at least now, by the plight of the rural voter is bipartisan, and that might mean that this is a space in which some real policy traction can be made.
Right. Yeah, thinking about those shared concerns. Well, I mean, even like the infrastructure bill that came out, I mean, that benefited a lot of rural areas. I don't know though whether rural Americans know or if that's enough necessarily to counteract all the other opinions a conservative rural voter might have about the Democratic Party. But yeah, I think there are avenues potentially. Yeah,
I think it's absolutely the case that the Biden administration, with the infrastructure bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, even just the Democratic Party platform, radically increased the number of times it said the word rural. So there are things that the Democratic Party is currently doing under Joe Biden to appeal to the rural voter. I share your concern that I'm not sure that many rural voters, when they see, the battery factory being built in their community that's going to maybe bring hundreds or thousands of jobs, I'm not entirely sure that they see that as Joe Biden brought jobs to their community, or that there are jobs coming to their community. And that distinction is going to be really important for whether or not those policies contribute in some ways, I think, to pushing back on what seemed to be a growing rural Republican, sort of complete takeover. But it's possible, I presume. I suppose some of that depends on the answer to our other question, which is about how much of this is actually about the material stuff versus more cultural things.
Right.
And that's what I wanted to ask you about next was, what are the cultural markers that you think rural people really hone in on? What are the things that make rural people feel culturally distinctive? And in your own work, how do you think about that in relation to, or maybe independently from, stuff like religion and race?
Yeah, so I think a rural culture, to the extent that there is a pan-rural culture in the United States, I think a lot of it has sort of formed because of a constellation of different other tendencies that happen. So for instance, there's sort of an overlap of perceived white working class values, for instance, or religious values, for instance. So things like moral traditionalism, so being, more morally conservative, that goes along with religiosity, but it is also more prevalent in rural areas, even controlling for religiosity. So I think some of those other sorts of pieces of what tends to be in rural areas sort of inform some of that rural culture. Or thinking about, like, as an example of working class values in quotations, sort of emphasizing the practical benefits of something. There's a question that someone asked, which I'm not going to directly address, but it's related. How do you get rural people who might distrust the university system to enroll or to want to go there? Well, you can do things like emphasize the practical benefits. And there's also variation, in universities and their values. They're not all, really left-wing. University of South Carolina has a very, lots of left and right-wing students, for example. Other things that might be sort of rural specific, I think, is an appreciation of nature, a slower pace of life. Community, I think, is very important to rural people. Not that it's not important elsewhere, but I think just by the nature of not having that many people around you, you want to form relationships with those around you more. You're sort of forced to. So those are some of the, I guess, values. There's also maybe some more, I would say, superficial values, or more like recreation-based values, for instance. So hunting, fishing, things like that, outdoor activities. All the way down to wearing a Carhartt jacket or something. So there's sort of these different signifiers, I think, that go along with ruralness. And it's also hard to, and this is true of trying to figure out any value system of any group, it's hard sometimes to try to actually identify what those values are. Are they actually held by the group, or are we just sort of stereotyping the group, which, this is an issue. We can sort of a lot of times say, oh, the hardworking rural America. Well, maybe the rest of America is also hardworking. Maybe we're just sort of engaging in a stereotype, for instance. But yeah, I guess I don't know if that answers your question in terms of those things. Or if you have anything to add, we're also from a rural area, so.
Yeah, that was, I noticed in the Q&A, one of the questions was whether or not either of us had lived a rural lifestyle before. I can say I grew up in a rural area in Kentucky. I went to college in a rural area in Kentucky. So yeah, I've spent most of my life in rural areas. I don't currently live in one, but I love rural spaces. I love Kentucky a lot. If you give me enough time, I'll turn this into a talk about Kentucky. But I'm a big fan and always have been. And I think you know, part of the reason that I started doing this research I mean, I would say the main reason that I do this research is because I grew up in a rural area. You also did as well, right?
Yeah, so I grew up on a corn and soybean family farm, corn and soybean farm in rural Minnesota, right by Iowa. So yeah, I grew up there, throughout my entire childhood. My dad, I would say he was a lifelong Democrat, but he was a rural identifier. He hated cities. Said he would never set foot in New York City. Because he was just too many people. I don't know. But and then I went to college in rural Minnesota. Though interestingly, that's the first time I sort of saw this clash culturally between where I grew up and some of the more like kids who grew up in suburban or urban America, because it was a small liberal arts college. And so, just as an illustration, they had at this college like a farmhouse. And I was like, oh, that sounds cool. Like I was in 4-H, maybe it'll be like that. And it was like these hipsters that like were sort of LARPing as like farmers, like, or, hippy dippy organic farmers. I was like, what is this? So there's that's where I started seeing this clash. But even after I graduated, I've lived at various points in rural areas. I've had to live in cities. I now live in, I would say, an exurb of Columbia, South Carolina. So yeah, I have quite a bit of experience living in rural communities. I ask people from where I grew up a lot of times, their opinions about things. A lot of the research as well in this area isn't just quantitative in surveys. The Kramer study we've talked about, that was a lot of in-depth interviews in rural Wisconsin. The Hochschild book, Strangers in Their Own Land, was in rural Louisiana. So there are voices being incorporated, rural voices being incorporated in this research in various ways. But yeah, it's a great question. I guess maybe we should turn to Q&A then at this point.
Yeah, so very interesting. And if you have more to say, we can stall the Q&A a bit. That's fine. I don't know if you had a chance to peruse some of the questions on your own. But, it seems like a, really difficult, terribly difficult, complex situation. You have a population that is discontented, that doesn't trust government. And obviously, from what you've said, not the Democrats in their policies. So I'm wondering what they are advocating for with the Republicans that they're supporting in terms of health policies and some of the other things that they don't like about government.
I'm not sure that that's why that they support the Republican Party. I think a lot of this is about as Chrissy was saying, a lot of this is about the identities of rural individuals themselves. And I think most people's partisanship, to boil it down very overly simplistically, is when you close your eyes and ask yourself, who do people like me vote for or identify with? The answer to that question for a lot of rural people is Republican, and it has been increasingly so for a while. But when they think of people like me, the variety of different groups that rural people find themselves in all increasingly identify and vote with the Republican Party. And they're just political scientists use a term, the lack of cross-cutting cleavages in some ways, I think contributes to this. In rural areas, there aren't a lot of individuals that find themselves in associations or schools or groups, whatever, with people who are from groups that are predominantly Democratic. That's not exclusively the case, but it's more so than otherwise. And I think that in part contributes to, rural America is not a monolith. I don't mean to imply that, but it's certainly has this sort of momentum of republicanism that seems to be building, that I think is in large part a social identity. I think in a lot of rural areas, people, when they think of rural, just simultaneously think of things that make them think Republican. And that's a hard battle for a Democratic politician or for any public policy to push back on. So I think when most rural people are voting, I think they're thinking, what party has my back generally? And they at least know that the Republican Party has their back culturally on a variety of different things. At least they think that. Materially, I don't know, Chrissy, you might disagree with me. I think there's a mixture of rural people think both parties have abandoned them materially, and so at least the Republican Party has their back culturally. But then there's others that exclusively think the Democratic Party has blamed them. And so I think either way, it basically pushes people rightward.
Yeah, I'm gonna say, yeah, that was a great response, and I agree. I think, it's kind of like there are two dimensions here. There's a left-right dimension, and then there's this sort of populist, dimension as well. So because rural people are actually quite a bit on the populist dimension, there's a lot of areas where it feels like neither party really represents them very well. There's a lot of ambivalence, I think, maybe more so than what we might be seeing with these numbers, even though they might be sort of, after a while, people start to, become repetitively Republican or whatever else. And yeah, I think the social issues are another big one. We've, ever since the middle of the 20th century and a little bit later, a lot of the strategy is on the political right has been to appeal to cultural issues. That's true, and that's going to be for rural voters as well as suburban and urban voters, who might have more conservative positions on social issues. And so that dimension, social versus economic, has become much more salient or much more sort of like talked about more over time, at least in the past several decades. That might be changing now. And so, in many ways, Trump, as sort of the figure here that gets talked about when we talk about rural voting recently, Trump sort of fulfills that, right? He's the populist, but also has some conservative views socially and in other ways. And he's, again, has that anti-establishment bit where it's not, no longer do I feel that, or, thinking about this sort of anti-establishment sentiment that comes out of this and seeing somebody who's not typical as a politician, I think sort of speaks to some of those grievances as well. So yeah, and another thing I did want to mention too very quickly, that a third of rural America is, didn't vote for Trump in the past election. That is not nothing. And, we think about this widening division, but they're historically, rural voters have been staunchly Republican or Democrat, excuse me. So there are ways where this can change. There is a large presence of rural Americans who do support Democratic policies and think they're good. So just to sort of caveat that as well, that there is a sizable minority.
Well, let's tackle some of the questions. I see a number have shown up, and if you feel you haven't answered these already, let's start with the first one, which is from Michael James. Do you foresee a possible revival of rural population by the younger demographic due to the cost of living and housing costs in urban areas?
So this is interesting because this happens in New England, or has happened in New England and then parts of the Mountain West in the past decade. Especially people who are wealthier will move to rural areas. Or if someone has like a tech job that can be remote or something like that. And so actually, as they do that, it ups the cost of living for everyone. It's good in many ways because makes it so that there's more people. But that's also, there's a drawback as well. other ways in which there's population gain in rural areas, which, by the way, the past 2 years have actually seen rural population gain for the first time after the long, many years of population loss, net loss in rural America. We're seeing a demographic change in rural America where there are some rural counties in the United States that are becoming more ethnically diverse. So that's happening in my home state of Minnesota. Rural Minnesota has historically, at least southern Minnesota, has historically been very white, but that is changing because a lot of the people working in some of the, say, meatpacking plants, agricultural workers, those tend to be, say, Hispanic minorities, Somali minority, other groups. And so we're actually seeing population increases in those places. And so, you know, in many ways, some parts of rural America are actually rebounding. You know, and then there are challenges with that. Other parts of rural America are also seeing retirees coming too. So that's happening in parts of South Carolina. So I think in some ways, yeah, there might be parts of rural areas that are going to increase and will increase, but and they may be attracted due to lower cost of living, for instance, but you know, it's going to also pose some challenges as well, potentially. And I don't know how widespread it's going to be because a lot of younger people want to live in city centers. They might perceive rural areas to be places that are hostile to them. So there's that barrier, or urban areas might have more things to do, things like that. But yeah, that's a good question.
I have a question here for you, Chrissy, and they say, giving rural communities more opportunities in STEM programs and higher education, as you suggest, is asking rural people to embrace urban values. How would you suggest giving urban communities more opportunities in rural value system?
So the first one, I think, is speaking to this perception that higher education is much more left-wing and has more left-wing urban values. As I said before, there's actually quite a bit of, you know, the universities and colleges that get a lot of attention, especially in news media, tend to be much more left-leaning, but there are lots of higher education institutions that are sort of balanced a lot across the political spectrum. You know, there's a broad variety of institutions that people can go to. And I think, you know, if, you know, speaking to maybe someone might not want to go because it's perceived as being sort of different. You know, I would counter that and say, well, there are options, I think, where someone could feel like, you know, it's not that way. That said, I think exposure to other value systems is great, but not everyone thinks that way. Another element with that is a lot of young people, and this was the case with me, and many people I knew growing up, is that a lot of rural high schoolers aren't aware of all the places they can apply and the things they can do after high school. So there might be certain routes like, oh, you can go to technical school or go into the military or start working. And then there's sort of like, okay, maybe you can go to the University of Minnesota or whatever, flagship university. But it didn't really occur to me, even though I was a good student, to like go somewhere else. If someone had sort of encouraged me, like, yeah, you could probably apply there and have a reasonable chance of getting in. You know, I think those types of things, knowing the opportunities, are actually one of those things that's a barrier. And then also, I think an issue with higher education and a lot of the country, not just rural, is this question of how beneficial is it? You know, is it a waste of time, a lot of money? So I think maybe emphasizing practical benefits of going into, say, STEM fields or other things would be good. And then with all this, you know, making STEM and other fields more inclusive. There's also a challenge of getting people to go back to rural areas too. So rural kids will leave, become a doctor, then they like won't come back. So that's another, like, brain drain's another issue. And then finally, the other question, giving urban communities more opportunities in rural value systems. That one's a little bit harder because there's not that sort of natural flow versus one way versus the other. I think one way is actually through media representations. So having more honest looks at rural Americans and their lives that don't rely on stereotypes can be helpful, showing them as normal people. You know, they're not all overall wearing farmers. In fact, a very small minority of people in rural America work in agriculture. Farming is a big stereotype. But that's one way, at least, to be exposed. I think broader society could be exposed to rural values and not necessarily even have it packaged as either being looking down on them or necessarily being rural coded, or excuse me, Republican coded, would be another way. So urban communities could kind of see, you know, they're people too. That makes sense.
So this is a question that is interesting from Betsy Elwin. Could you address regional differences? Why do rural areas in the Northeast seem to be reacting differently from the rest of the country, or are they?
I think some of this has to do with the demographics of the individuals that live in the rural areas in the Northeast versus other places. There's relatively higher levels of education in the rural areas of the Northeast, as well as relatively lower levels of evangelical Christianity. And so some of the other, some of the group differences that we might think might be animating part of the other aspects of the rural urban divide beyond explicitly things tied to urban, or excuse me, tied specifically to rural, are just fundamentally different. Between those spaces, there are lots of people, for example, that are from Boston that live in rural Massachusetts and things like that. And so that's a community, it's a region where the flow is a little bit different in some ways than, you know, retirees and things like that than the other parts of the other rural parts of America. But that's, I think, an interesting and important way to highlight the fact that rural voters and rural communities are not monolithic in any way. The rural West, very different than the rural South, very different than Appalachia, very different than the Northeast. And I think a lot of that has to do with demographically the kinds of individuals that live in these different rural areas. And the groups that they're associated with different political histories, but also I think some of the uniquenesses of the social and political economies of those areas.
Okay,
That's
and
my
from
take
Stanley Goodman, this is for you, Michael. As far as I know, he says, most EU countries have national health care, and each has its own healthcare method. They also have rural and urban, suburban populations. So what can we learn from them?
It's a great question. So I think this is important. In my work, I draw a lot on EU countries to make comparisons because the EU had, or at least, so take the UK, for example. There are very similar urban-rural political divides there, very similar levels of like rural identity and rural white working class sort of populism. However, there are not rural health disparities in the UK. In fact, there are urban health disparities in the UK, but they're very, very small. And if you look throughout the EU and you look throughout sort of Western industrialized democracies, what you see are not rural health disparities, but are very modest urban health disparities driven largely by immigrant and refugee populations in major urban areas across Europe. And so even though we see some of the same politics, we don't see some of the same health outcomes. And that's why in a lot of my work, I attribute a lot to what's going on in the US as, at least from the health outcomes aspects, is being driven by policy differences that are unique to the US that sort of animate the extreme rural urban health differences that we observe in the US in comparison to other and Western industrialized democracies. But it does suggest that other sources of things of decline outside of health And the other sort of cultural markers of rural identity that Christy was talking about that are more global are driving these types of phenomenon elsewhere, which I think is really helpful for illuminating what this is all about for a lot of people. I don't think people's attitudes about healthcare are why they identify as Republicans or Democrats, but I think their attitudes about healthcare and their experiences with healthcare are emblematic and correlated with these other types of rural decline that we've been talking about, which are present elsewhere. But I do think it does suggest something really fascinating about the unique aspects of rural culture if these types of divides are being observed across the globe.
Okay, I'm here from Susan Bolanos. She says she loves rural areas. Do you agree the only way out of poverty is school?
No, but it helps. I mean, I think for some people, a college education is the right move. But I think we've certainly hit the point, given how expensive it is and how many careers exist now that do not require, especially 4-year degrees, that this isn't something that I think we should say as the guaranteed path to success anymore. I think about things like some people who like to be a little more snooty to rural Americans will say things like, you should learn to code. Well, things like artificial intelligence are going to make coding pretty irrelevant for most people's jobs most of the time in the near future. And so there's a world where the things that we've sort of banked on and sort of said as the clear path to success in America are changing in some ways because our economy is changing in a lot of different ways. But I think it's also just it's not true empirically that it's required by any means, and I think that's probably less so now than ever, in part because so many people have college educations that's less of a distinguishing factor. I think higher education is a great thing. I think going to college has a variety of fantastic benefits, but ending poverty isn't necessarily the immediate outcome of entering in higher education for a lot of people. And I think you got to really think about whether or not it's going to add to your poverty potentially if it's not the right move for you. But I think for a lot of rural people, higher education is a sore spot because it's ultimately the lure that leads a lot of rural people away from their communities. And so for their neighbors, their family members, their peers, I think there's at least some non-trivial amount of resentment towards higher education, not only from being individuals who themselves maybe didn't attend, but because it's what's ultimately leading some of their loved ones to leave.
Yeah.
And why they don't come back, right? Regardless of what the economic outcomes are. And so I think education's a really complicated thing in rural areas, higher education, that is. But I think there are lots of ways to earn a good living, especially perhaps in rural communities, without leaving for college. And I think the more we invest in rural areas with rural infrastructure, things like broadband, stuff like that, the more likely it is that that's the case for some people, that they can stay where they are and they don't have to leave.
Well, I think we'll take a couple of things. A couple of the questioners are thanking you. And one of the questions that you answered, they felt was an excellent answer and they'd like to know more. And that makes me feel like we can close out the program at this point on a good note. And I actually want to thank you so much because I know I learned a lot and I have a feeling our audience learned a lot, and that's the whole purpose of having programs like this. So I want to thank you very much for providing so much good information and a good discussion. And I think we're going to revisit this because this is not going away. And we'd love to have you back sometime in the future to give an update. Does that sound good?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Happy to.
And to the audience, thank you so much for participating and providing some good questions. And I would like also to tell you we'll be sending out a survey, and we benefit so much from your input. So please take the time tomorrow when you get the survey to complete it. It's very short. And then finally, on June 4th, guess what the subject is? It's going to be healthcare. And we have some two terrific speakers, gurus on the healthcare system, and you'll have a chance to learn more about America's healthcare system and what its future could be. So with that, I'm going to close the program. Thank you so much, and we'll talk again. So
Thank
good
you.
night, and good night, audience. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.